we are going to look at what happens, if you have your calculator here, what happens when you type in -3 squared and when you put brackets around the -3 and put -3 squared. So I'm going to pull out my calculator here. I'm going to write the first one, -3 squared. Any ideas, mental math, try to figure this out. Right? What is the 3 to the 2? That exponent means repeated multiplication. Okay? Now, when I push enter, I get -9. The question you have to ask yourself is order of operations here. What is happening? Why is the answer -9? Why isn't the answer +9? And when I put brackets around it, so let's try this, -3 squared. Why is this one +9? So in your notes, you can write here that this one's equal to -9 and this one's equal to +9. Now the reason is BEDMAS and the definition of what a power is. What's the base? What's the exponent? Okay? So when you have -3 squared, do we have a power? Yes. What is the base of that power? In fact, I'm going to put that power in a yellow box. There's the power. The negative is not part of the power. The exponent of 2 only touches the 3. The exponent of 2 does not touch the negative. So this one is equal to negative. And remember what an exponent means. You could write it in expanded form. That 3 squared means 3 times 3. So if you have a negative times 3 times 3, you get a -9. As opposed to -3 squared, the squared is hitting the whole -3. And so when you have -3 squared, it means the base is -3, and you get -3 times -3. And a negative times a negative is positive. One of the things that people make as a mistake is they say, I'm going to multiply in this one, the top one, the negative times the 3 first, and then I'm going to do the exponent. But if you look at your exponent laws, your BEDMAS, your order of operations, the E stands for exponents. We do exponents before we multiply. So when you have -3 squared without the brackets, it's a negative times 3 squared. You have to do the exponent first before you multiply. So here's some more examples. Now remember yesterday when I was talking about multiplying with a negative? Okay? And if you have an odd number of negatives multiplied together, you get a negative answer. If you have an even number of negatives multiplied together, you know what page we're on. An even number of negatives make it positive. Now we have to also consider in here, is the negative in the exponent or not? So for the first one, can you see that that cubed does not hit the negative? The exponent of 3 is only to the 1. So you might even want to rewrite that with that negative out in front. You don't need to do that step. But this would mean you do 1 cubed first. What is 1 times 1 times 1? Yeah, I caught you there, didn't I? So 1 times 1 times 1 is 1. You still have the negative out in front. The first one is -1. The second one, the negative is inside the brackets. So the negative is getting squared as well. If you have 2 negatives, because that squared would be repeat multiplication 2 times, is it going to be positive or negative? Because you have 2 negatives. It's going to be positive. And 1 times 1, so this one is going to be positive 1. The next one, the negative is inside, so it's different than the first one, where the negative was outside. But if you have a negative times a negative times a negative 3 times, will your answer be negative or positive? It'll be negative, and 1 times 1 times 1 will still be 1. So this is an interesting thing that's happening here. The first one and the third one, they're different, but they end up with the same answer. The first one means a negative 1 times 1 times 1. The third one means negative 1 times a negative 1 times a negative 1. But just by coincidence, they happen to be the same answer. Okay? The fourth one, there's no brackets. So the negative stays outside. The first thing we have to do is 1 to the exponent of 203. Okay? I could act this out. I'm going to start. Okay? What is 1 times 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 1? Whew. That'd probably take me 5 minutes just to say all the ones if I had to say 203 of them. But if you multiply 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 1 times 203 times, what are you going to get? 1. And then that negative would still be out in front. This one is going to be negative 1. The next one, the negative is inside the brackets, so the negative 1 is the base. Negative 1 to the 20 with brackets, this would mean negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 20 times. So if you do the ones, just the numbers by themselves, 1 times 1 times 1 times 1, 20 times is going to be 1. What about the negative? If you have 20 negatives all multiplied together, will it be positive or will it be negative? And why? 20 is an even number. If you have an even number of negatives and you multiply them together, you will get a positive number. And finally, negative 1 to the 555. The negative 1 is the base. So this will be negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1, 555 times. So if we do the number first, what is 1 times 1 times 1? If you did that 555 times, still going to be 1. And what would happen if you had 555 negatives all multiplied together? Would it be positive or would it be negative? And why? It's an odd number, so it's going to be negative. So some notes. A power with a negative base. If you do not have the brackets around that base, that negative is out in front, your answer will always be negative. So your example, negative 4 squared, that would equal negative 16. The negative means that that isn't even part of the base, it's just out in front. If it is brackets and you have an even exponent, so if I do have brackets with that negative 4 and I have an even exponent of 2, well, a negative times a negative is positive. That would be positive 16. If you have brackets and an odd exponent, so if I have negative 2 cubed, a negative times a negative times a negative, my answer will be negative. Logan, 2 times 2. Times 2. Excellent. So this will be negative 8. So I'm going to give you a head start. I'm going to walk around. I want you to see your answers that you put down for these ones. All right, we're going to go over these. If you were unable to finish in that time, then you'll want to pay extra attention. Right? If you were unable to finish in that time, you'll want to pay extra attention. If you were finished, you'll want to check how did you do on these questions. Now I'm going to show lots of work. Here. Well, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to write down the answer first. Negative 4 squared. The answer to this one is negative 16. The work that you could show, the negative, is outside of the power. It is not part of the base. The base, the 2, the exponent of 2, is just to the 4. This one means negative 4 times 4. That's in expanded form. 4 times 4 is 16 times a negative gives you negative 16. B, the negative is outside of the brackets. 7 to the exponent 1. Well, that just means you have 1 7. 1 7 times a negative out front will give you negative 7. Part C. We have a negative 1 inside the brackets and a negative outside. The answer to this one is positive 1. To show your work, you could write it in expanded form. There's a negative out front, but then we would have negative 1 3 times. Negative 1 3 times is going to be 1, and a negative 3 times is going to be negative. But then we have that other negative out front, and another negative times a negative will make it positive. Separate these. Change colors probably in between. Part D. The negative is out in front. The 5 cubed, the answer is going to be negative 125. The work, this is negative 5 times 5 times 5. 5 times 5 is 25. If you have 5 quarters, how much money would you have? If you had 5 quarters, $1.25. So that can help you do this mental math. 5 times 5 is 25, times another 5 will give you 125. Because if you had 5 quarters, you'd have $1.25, which would be 125 cents. Negative 2 to the 4. The answer to this one is positive 16. Switch colors. Positive 16. If you wanted to show your work, the negative is inside the brackets. It's part of the base. You're going to have a negative 2 times a negative 2 times a negative 2. This is the expanded form. 2 times 2 times 2. Careful. Times 2 again? 16. And so the numbers, 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 will give you 16. And then 4 negatives, because it's an even number, will be positive. And finally, negative 10 to the 4. The negative is inside the brackets, so when you write it in expanded form, it'll be 10,000. Okay, it's going to be positive because you have 4 negatives, even number. 10 times 10 is 100 with 2 zeros. Times 10, add another 0, 3 zeros. Times 10, add another 0. 4 zeros in the end for 10,000. These ones, I want you to type them into your calculator and get an answer. If you don't have a calculator, you can come pick one up. So the first one was 2 to the exponent of 9. So instead of writing 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, 9 of them, this is a lot faster. And the answer is 512. 3 to the 5. So instead of writing that out, go 3 to the power 5, I get 243. The third one has the negative inside the brackets and it's power 6. First of all, without a calculator, if you looked at this, can you tell if it's going to be positive or negative? It's going to be positive because we're going to have a negative 6 times. Now when I go to my calculator, I put the brackets, write it in just as I see it, negative 5 to the 6, push enter, 15, 625. So the thing about these questions, It's not whether or not you know math or not. It's whether you have the ability to use a calculator. Okay? Now, a lot of people think using a calculator is common sense. But if you don't practice it, you still have things to learn, right? Because this is probably the first time you're learning about that exponent key. And it's not very hard. That's trigonometry. You'll do that next year. The last one, when you look at it, if this was non-calculator, can you tell me if that answer is going to be positive or negative? It's going to be negative. Why? The negative is outside. So you only have the one negative. And when we type it into our calculator, exactly as we see it, negative 6 to the 4. Negative 1296. So there's your homework. We're going to work on this for the next 10 minutes.